All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're taking a really deep, analytical look at one of the darkest chapters in human history. We're deconstructing the core Nazi belief system. You know, you really have to ask, how does an extreme ideology actually take root in a modern society? How are millions of people manipulated into backing a system that's literally built on hatred? Well, we're going to objectively break down the historical facts and the actual anatomy of this dictatorship to figure out the sheer mechanics of mass manipulation.
To truly grasp the weight of this ideology, we have to look at the aftermath. Consider this. Why did an 11-year-old boy named Helmut refuse to eat his own mother's food for 9 years after World War II? The story is absolutely chilling. Helmut was just a random German boy, but his father was a Hitler supporter. One day, Helmut overhears his parents, who are absolutely terrified that they're going to face the exact same horrors they had inflicted on the Jews. Not long after a family picnic in the woods, Helmut's father goes into his office and shoots himself. Little Helmut actually watched his dad's uniform burn in the family fireplace. The trauma was so immense that for the next 9 years, he wouldn't eat anything his mother prepared because he was terrified it was poisoned. It's a heartbreaking story, but it perfectly captures the psychological ruin left behind by a system built completely on fear.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to systematically break this down into 5 sections. First, the roots of extremist ideology. Second, the Nazi racial hierarchy. Third, scapegoating and extreme hatred. Fourth, indoctrinating the youth. And finally, the catastrophic cost of that hatred.
All right, starting with Section 1, Roots of Extremist Ideology, the Soil for Dictatorship. Look, dictatorships don't just appear out of thin air, right? They need fertile soil. So what actually made the German public so vulnerable to this kind of manipulation? Let's walk through this rapid sequence of national humiliations. Germany loses World War I in 1918. That leads directly to the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which basically shattered the nation's stability. Germany was absolutely stripped of its resources. We're talking losing 13% of its territories, 75% of its iron, and 26% of its coal. Just massive losses. And that sparks a devastating chain reaction. Hyperinflation in 1923, and by 1932, a crippling mass unemployment crisis with over 6 million people out of work. And the sheer scale of this economic crushing was just staggering. The Allied powers slapped Germany with a massive financial reparation bill of £6.6 billion. Try to wrap your head around that immense debt, especially when the country had just had its primary industrial and resource-rich areas, like the Ruhr Coal District, completely seized.
So to pay this unpayable debt, the government essentially just started printing money. And that is what leads to hyperinflation. It got so bad that the currency lost its value almost instantly. People literally needed a wheelbarrow full of cash just to buy a single loaf of bread. Imagine that. And then the American Great Depression hits shortly after, which pulls away vital financial support. At that point, the German public completely lost faith in their existing government, the Weimar Republic. They were starving, humiliated, desperate, and they started looking for extreme alternatives. Hitler, who had actually tried and failed to take power by force earlier, saw this despair and weaponized it. He promised a better future and managed to secure around 38 million votes in the 1932 elections.
Moving on to Section 2, the Nazi racial hierarchy, a manufactured caste system.
So, once they had the power, how did this regime actually organize society? Well, they built it on a remarkably rigid hierarchy that was entirely unscientific and brutally strict. Under this system, human worth was determined solely by physical appearance and supposed racial purity. At the very top tier, the regime placed blonde, blue-eyed Nordic German Aryans, basically deeming them the only healthy, valuable members of society. And at the bottom tier, Jews, along with other minorities and the physically disabled. The regime labeled them a lower class of humanity and straight up declared them enemies of the state.
Which brings us to Section 3, Scapegoating and Extreme Hatred, the Final Solution.
Now, you might be wondering, how was this twisted hierarchy actually weaponized? It was done through systematic blame and extreme persecution. Because, you see, the regime didn't just start with gas chambers. They started with a narrative. They pushed this completely fabricated myth that the German army was stabbed in the back by civilian leaders, Marxists, and Jews during World War I. By labeling these everyday citizens as internal enemies who caused the nation suffering, they basically created a justification for horrifying actions. And it escalated systematically, from forced segregation into ghettos all the way to the creation of death camps, where men, women, and children were systematically murdered in gas chambers.
And this highlights something absolutely crucial. the total, uncompromising intolerance of this ideology. The regime wasn't interested in converting their so-called enemies or finding some kind of common ground. Not at all, because they defined people strictly by race. They reached the horrifying conclusion that final elimination, meaning systematic death, was the literal only acceptable solution to the problems they had manufactured.
Let's dive into Section 4, Indoctrinating the Youth, Weaponizing Education and Gender.
If you want to sustain that level of extreme hatred, a regime knows it can't just rely on adults. They have to target the kids. Within the school system, they rolled out this highly organized, step-by-step process of indoctrination. Step 1. Jewish teachers were fired. Step 2. They aggressively segregated the students. So-called Aryan children were strictly forbidden from sitting with Jewish children, and disabled children were tragically expelled and eventually sent to gas chambers. Step 3. Textbooks were completely rewritten to shove Nazi propaganda down kids' throats. And finally, the entire curriculum was reshaped with one goal: teaching hatred of minorities and demanding absolute, unquestioning loyalty to Hitler.
But the manipulation didn't stop at the classroom door. It extended deeply into how they viewed gender itself. The state dictated exactly what it meant to be a man or a woman. Boys were relentlessly taught that they had to be aggressive, strong, and exceptionally masculine. They were basically being groomed from day one to be future soldiers. And girls? They were taught that equality simply didn't exist. Their sole purpose, according to the state, was to be submissive mothers whose only duty was to breed pure Aryan children and maintain racial purity. The state literally rewarded women who produced these desirable children and severely punished those who didn't.
And that leads us to our final section, Section 5, The Cost of Hatred, Annihilation and Aftermath. When you have an ideology that's entirely bent on aggressive expansion and extreme hatred, it really can only lead to one historical outcome, right: the total annihilation of the very nation it claimed to champion. Blinded by this obsessive need for territorial expansion to fix their economy, Germany invaded Poland in 1939, and then disastrously turned on the Soviet Union in 1941. By fighting a multi-front war, the German military stretched itself to the absolute breaking point. The endgame was total national collapse. Soviet forces pushed right into Berlin, and trapped in his underground bunker, Hitler actually consulted his physician on how to commit suicide, ultimately using a pistol and poison to end his own life.
The sheer scale of the destruction, the millions upon millions of